Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and the winner for the poll for today's video was, why did British immigrants vote to leave? So first of all, a little bit on linguistics. When I approached the topic, there were typically two types of comment. One was saying, don't I mean emigrants or expats, because that's people who come to a country, but that's exactly what they are. I'm not talking about people who immigrate to Britain. This is about people who are British that are immigrants, therefore they are in some other country. And of course, what I'm really talking about is in the EU. So that's people who've come to Spain, France, Greece, Italy, Germany, wherever the hell. They are immigrants in a country that is not Britain because they're British citizens. But the second point, which should come as no surprise, and it was always going to be the first point I'd have to raise, is someone saying about, don't I mean expats? And that is a telling feature. This is a term that seems to me to be uniquely British. And I think that's the crux of what a large portion of the Brexit problem is, this dissociation of things. So lots of people growing up in this country, for example, have been indoctrinated with the idea that immigration is bad and that immigrants themselves come to destroy our way of life, even though the British way of life has depended upon immigration for 2,000 years. There's never been a period of time when we haven't had it and we haven't benefited from it. But when they migrate themselves, does that make them bad? No, of course not. How could it? They're not bad people. So they can't call themselves immigrants because they have this negative association with the term immigrants and immigration. So they call themselves expats. Oh, that's fine. That's all. That sounds nice. I'm an expat. I'm not an immigrant. I'm an expat. And it's that dissociation of these terms that allows them to think of migrants from other countries as bad, but not include themselves in that. Another thing to point out at this juncture, I don't mean to give the impression here as well that a majority of British immigrants voted to leave. In fact, it was actually a British migrant group that tried to get the result thrown out in court on the basis that it was illegal, which it was. But as I've already explained on this channel already, it wasn't binding. So the courts can't do anything. If it was a binding vote, if the referendum was actually a binding vote, then actually the courts could have done something about it because it was illegal. But it wasn't. The reason why we triggered Article 50, I can't say it had nothing to do with the referendum result, but it wasn't legally linked to the referendum result. It was because a majority of MPs just did it. They voted for it. That's all there is to it. Yes, of course, their reasoning for voting for it was the referendum result. But legally speaking, we're leaving the EU because MPs have voted for it. Indeed, actually, some immigrants didn't even get a vote. If you've lived outside of the UK for 15 years, you are no longer eligible for voting rights. Even in a situation such as this, you can understand it from the point of view of most votes taking place that affect British things. But even from the point of view of something that's going to determine your citizenship, which sounds really weird, but, rules is rules. So getting back to leave voting immigrants, the fact that it's even possible, even though they're in the minority, the fact that it's even possible for journalists to have found some seems incredible to me. And I've been able to read a number of reports on it over the past couple of years. It's quite staggering. So they must exist in some numbers, albeit a minority. And you've got things like, because what makes it surprising to me, things like settlement rights, pensions, healthcare, benefits, even whether you're allowed to buy or even rent property, are all fairly uncertain in the event of splitting from the EU. No one is saying that it is impossible to live in an EU country if you're not part of the EU. There's people from other countries that do so. But at the moment, many of those people are living in the EU as a citizen of the EU and get access to all sorts of benefits that aren't available to, say, someone from America or Canada or Japan. So, whether you're talking about people who moved abroad to retire, because that's quite common, or just to work, economic migrants, that choice of lifestyle is under threat because of the very action of voting to leave, which is why it was so surprising to me. So why did they do it? Now, one piece I was reading was remarking about the very different ways in which the British migrate, in stark contrast to those of other nationalities. So when migrants from other nations move for work, typically what they'll do is they'll need to find somewhere to live near their new workplace. They've got themselves a job, right? I need to move there, I need to find somewhere to live. Get a load of luggage, get going. Whereas it describes the British create little pockets of Britain in their adopted homes. They turn the places, along with other British migrants, into little British villages and towns. You're sort of used in any area, if you've got a community of people from a particular nation, obviously they're going to sort of group together, form associations, things like that. But, you know, and you must see it whenever you go abroad to the continent. I don't do it an awful lot. I'm not really a big fan of travelling. But when you do, it's quite common to find British pubs, isn't it? You know, and British stores and things like that. You don't really see that so much in this country. You know, you might see a section selling Polish food in a supermarket or something like that. But you don't really see French department stores or German pubs. You know, if you see anything like that, it'd be like themed. But even that, you don't really see that. So yeah, so I can appreciate that. I can understand that we have a very different way of behaving as immigrants. But it has to be said, there's not a lot of these articles saying they don't actually ruin the local aesthetic. That would be pointless after all. You know, one common reason for the British moving there, particularly for retirement purposes, is because they like the aesthetic of their destination. You know, maybe they're always moaning about the bleeded weather in Britain and want to go somewhere with a warmer climate or, you know, whatever. Now, I read a piece a few months ago, which is actually quite heartwarming, and it was about a British contingent that had moved to a half-abandoned French village. This was a village that had long ago, you know, lost most of its own natural residents and was sort of crumbling into disrepair. They came along, restored the buildings, even getting community events going again, but all part and parcel of the French customs and traditions, not their own. They were properly integrated. And you know, with Brexit, you know, this report was saying the French locals are actually concerned that they're going to lose their newfound restored community, as many of those British immigrants were finding they could no longer afford to live there as the pound weakened, as well as concerns over healthcare costs. There's one fella who has healthcare costs of hundreds of pounds a month. You know, if that disappeared overnight, couldn't afford it. So, you know, if they're suddenly unable to access services as a member of the EU, and just since the referendum in terms of the income thing, if you've gone there, as I say, if you're retired, you've got your pension and whatever else you've got to live on, the pound has dropped 12% against the euro in that time just so far. And of course, it can easily, and in fact would likely drop more in the event of a no deal. That could be quite worrying. That, you know, I mean, just imagine, you know, maybe the wage you're on now, and you may have a lot of disposable income, maybe you could absorb it, but just imagine if it was to suddenly drop by 12%, because there may be a sudden drop overnight, and I think some people have probably been returning, and we know a lot of people have been returning, probably because if you think about it, if I plan for it, it's going to take some time to move back and sort everything out without losing too much money. And I need to be able to do that quickly. Let's say we were to go off a cliff edge and everything's very sudden then. They might literally find themselves without, you know, being able to get themselves back easily. Because you can't do it overnight. But you might find suddenly that your income is no longer meeting your expenditure. Quite difficult. Now, for all the railing against immigrants that you hear in the pubs of Britain, I have to say, I have yet to see places in the UK, like I've already said, which make their own villages, you know, or theatres with traditional plays from their own country. Where's the French or Italian equivalents of Marks and Spencer's, Debenhams in the high street? And in the same way that you see those British stores in those migrant towns on the continent. There is this very different attitude of British immigrants compared to immigrants from other nationalities. It's quite intriguing, really. And it did change my view, I have to say, reading that article. I was quite heartened by it, because I'd almost imagined that the reason why the British consider themselves different to other immigrants was not for any entirely positive at all. Give themselves a special name. Expats don't want to be called immigrants. Thank you very much. Immigrants is for foreign people. Missing entirely the fact that they are foreigners when they're not in Britain. And you get this attitude that do they think of themselves? Because I don't know many people. I've known a few friends of my dad, but I've not really known people closely that have done this. So, it's easy to sort of think of, do they just think of themselves as self-appointed British High Commissioners from the days of empire or something? But stories of Britons integrating into new homes and integrating with the overall community, which I know doesn't always happen, does actually give me a little bit of faith about that. Now, the other thing is reading the various reports. The most common reasons given are, bizarrely, benefits and, wait for it, immigration. Oh, there's too much immigration. Oh, I think we need to vote against staying in the EU because there's too much immigration. Anyway, onto the benefits thing though, because you have this, and I've seen comments on my videos as well, you get this attitude among some people who favour Brexit that, our people go over there, pay their own way, people come to this country and they're just instantly claiming benefits. It's not actually true. In fact, there's a higher proportion of British immigrants in non-UK EU countries claiming unemployment benefits than there are non-UK EU citizens claiming those same benefits in this country. So that's a nonsense. That's an absolute nonsense. And I don't think I should even need to further comment on the idea that some of those people voting Leave did so on the strength of the immigration argument, when you're actually an immigrant. But that's probably where that dissociation comes into it. Don't think of themselves as immigrants. Interesting, when I posed the topic, someone did reply in the community thread to say they knew a few British immigrants to the EU and they described some of their reasons being racism. Now, racism is a scourge that exists throughout the world. It exists in every country. I can't help but notice whenever I bring up any aspect of British racism in videos, I will see comments of racism directed against the British, seemingly in support of what I'm saying, as if that's supposed to be helpful. Because that's another thing. When one group of people is racially abused, they see it as racism without any issues of clarity whatsoever. But when they are racist to other groups of people, they're not being racist. Their generalisation of an entire group of potentially millions or even tens of millions of people, that's entirely justified. That's not racism. That's just the way it is. And, again, you get this dissociation there. So racism exists. All societies have racists in them. And all societies will be racially abused themselves by other societies. We shouldn't judge a community by the actions of just some. In addition, I'm still not sure how that's a reason to leave. If you're living abroad and are subject to racist abuse, as many communities within Britain are, even those who are British themselves. I mean, think about the poor lad who's reporting the news this weekend. This poor kid who's now afraid to leave his home because some thugs have scrawled "No blacks" on his front door. And when they called the police didn't even turn up to investigate. And we have this appalling level of racism in this country, but you have it in other countries as well. It exists elsewhere as well. And people like to be blind to the racism in their own community, see it a mile off in other communities. But, that's just unfortunately how people are. But I don't understand if that's, how that's a reason for leaving the EU. Do they think that racism is going to stop if they leave the EU? They're living in the EU still, even after Brexit, or they hope they are. How's that going to stop it? So the terrible impact of racism, of course, can be as bad as physical assault. Of course, we understand this. Like the little boy, as I say, afraid to go out of his house. I mean, he didn't just look at it and go, "Oh, that's a pain in the neck. My dad's going to have some difficulty repainting the door." No, he's afraid because it's the threat of what may come next. And, but I still don't get how a vote to leave the organisation, the very organisation that guarantees our rights to a peaceful existence through European Convention on Human Rights, especially when many in the current governing party want for those laws to be the first on the fire as soon as we Brexit, to be replaced with what they say is going to be, oh, we're going to have a British Bill of Rights, which is unsurprisingly proposed to be a damn sight shorter. I really don't get how that vote brings about that change. The other thing said was about the dependence of the UK on other EU nations. Now, when it comes to Brexit arguments, almost all of them are utterly ridiculous. Sorry, they are, and I've gone through a great many of them. But there are a couple for which I will give credit for. I disagree, but I will give them credit for, and this is one of them. Since we joined the European community, of course, we have become ever more entwined and interdependent with our European neighbours. Personally, I see it as a good thing because we have become stronger as a result of it. But some are opposed to it on that principle. Fair enough. That's politics. But just like another reasonable argument about globalist capitalism, you don't stop it by leaving. Yes, there is now a massive interdependence between the UK and other member states. That is why Brexit has been described as one of the two greatest threats to the global economy. We are in the action of unravelling an awful lot of that interdependence. But for me, it's a bit like complaining that you don't want to be attached to other mountain climbers, so you opt to cut the line. That does nobody any good, yourself included. Because we are entwined. You can't just unpick it quickly. But at least I can sympathise with the reasoning. You know, that's a political position. Fine. Even if I don't believe that the proposed solution will help you out. So when it comes down to it, those immigrants who did vote to leave did so largely for the same reasons as those still living in Blighty, actually. Some of them have medical costs, like I say, of hundreds of pounds a month. What are they going to do? That's currently covered because they're EU citizens. Some of them have seen their incomes drop and are going to see their incomes drop still further, living in the EU because of the weaker pound. Some are wondering if they'll be able to carry on living and working in Europe after March. In some of those little British islands, little British villages on the continent, there's been already as much as 40% from some of them moving back to Britain because either it has already become untenable to remain or because they couldn't cope with a cliff edge Brexit. So the safer option is just to return just in case. And just to finish on a perplexing note, I was watching a recent interview, one that was done in the last week, with going around again, some of these expats, as they call themselves, British immigrants, who did vote to leave. They're still saying they voted to leave. And who've conceded that they may have shot themselves in the foot now. But I'm not sure what they thought was going to happen by voting to detach their home nation from the nation in which they now make their home. That's a bit of a puzzler for me. But anyway, that's my take on, the British immigrants who voted to leave. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, click the bell notification as well, and there'll be another poll going up as well. It will possibly be for tomorrow's video, but it may be for Wednesdays. It depends if anything really exciting happens tomorrow, which it may or may not. So we will see. There may be some breaking news tomorrow. We'll all see. But until next time, I'll see you later.